Check, check. Hello, everyone. Everyone, say something back to me so that I know you're listening.
Hello.
Wonderful. We got a lively audience. Well, we're excited. This is the third Shared Roots class that we've done. Obviously, we're in a different venue tonight. Pastor Peter Young right here at Bridgeway was very excited to hear about the class and very excited to be able to host. So unfortunately, he's not here with us tonight, but a great leader in the community and a lover of the Jewish community. And deep roots and relationships, actually, as a pastor here in Denver with some of our Jewish community. So we're very thankful for him. Just in case you don't know, in case this is your first time, my name's Jeremy Jacobs. I lead an organization called Stories of Anti-Semitism. We're a Christian-run organization that's standing up against anti-Semitism, bringing awareness and education in churches and among Christians. So that's why I'm here, because doing things like this is our bread and butter. We feel like one of the best ways to fight anti-Semitism is to be a comfort to our Jewish friends. And so how better to comfort one another than to just come together, right, and build some friendships and some relationships. And so a little bit later, after Father Walker is done talking, we told him he can only go 2 hours tonight. That was a joke. You got 50 minutes. But we'll have a little time. We'll take a bathroom break. You can mingle. Please meet people. Please meet somebody new and strike up conversation. I'm also thinking of housekeeping things, which I never think of, but I'm thinking of them right now. There is bottled water on the back table. There's a lot of it. Also, if you don't know where the bathrooms are, you walk straight out those doors and go all the way to the wall and take a left, and you'll see the signage. So we do have water and we do have bathrooms. We did think of that. And I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to let you go. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Ooh, all right. Well, this is Father Theron Walker, Emmaus Anglican in Castle Rock, Colorado. Yep. And I think you won't be disappointed that you came to hear him tonight.
Thank you, Jeremy.
All right.
So I'm Theron Walker, and I want to pull up a picture here. Pull up the next picture, please. So in 1986, I was a student at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and for a summer mission for college, I somehow convinced, my mom didn't have to be convinced, but this is how it always went, but my dad had to be convinced that it wasn't a good job to go home to Buffalo and paint houses for the summer. I wanted to go to Israel and do volunteer work for the summer. And so somehow or another, I think my mom prevailed on my father again, and I ended up going to Israel for the summer of 1986. And there I am. Hey, hello there. On the far right, your left, with the Policemen's Welfare Association, which is organized, so this is from the Jerusalem Post. It was organizing a clubhouse for police sappers out of ruins. So the deal was, we're there doing volunteer work, and I spent about a month basically at a nursing home, working outside this nursing home. It was on the old road to Emmaus, from Jerusalem to Emmaus. It was a Roman watchtower that had grown over with just brush, and so I worked outside with a madir, like a madir. It's kind of like a hoe. And clippers, and just cleaned up this site. That's what I did. Got one of the worst sunburns in my life, blisters and everything. So we did that for about a month, and then we went and worked for the Jerusalem Bomb Squad for 2 weeks, which was fascinating. And that sounds like, oh my goodness, you worked for the Jerusalem Bomb Squad. We did light construction for the Jerusalem Bomb Squad. Their headquarters was in the old Russian compound in Jerusalem. And it was kind of like their clubhouse for the sappers, the bomb squad. And they had a little museum in their clubhouse of bombs that they had dismantled. Everything from soup cans that had nails in them that would be placed in a grocery store, a shoe with a big heel that maybe a bomb is put in the bottom of the heel of a shoe. Just all these kind of dastardly things. And they had this big collection of these things that they kind of kept to bring people, to show to people, to say, like, this is what we're dealing with here. So, but they'd outgrown this place, so they wanted to build a new clubhouse. So my team, working with Bridges for Peace, ends up working with the Jerusalem Bomb Squad. So if I could have the next slide, that's their little robot that they use. It has a Browning shotgun on it, and they operate it from inside a van. And oftentimes when they can't figure out what the bomb is, they just take their little robot over there with the Browning shotgun, and boom, they just like take it out that way. This was developed by the Brits to deal with the IRA. I don't know what they do now, but this was 1986, okay? So I don't know. Maybe they have a drone now. But in those 2 weeks, we got to spend a lot of time with the crew from the Jerusalem Bomb Squad. It was really amazing. Got to spend one Shabbat in the home of a guy who was actually featured in Life magazine. Life magazine did a big article about the Jerusalem Bomb Squad, and he was on the cover, but he had on all his gear. His face was hidden. We got to go to parties with them. Went to the West Bank to pick up some bricks to do something, and this was before the Intifada. So it was really a truly remarkable experience and a way to just be friends, to build bridges for peace. So I came home from my summer in Israel in 1986, and I changed my major from evangelism. You know, I was at Oral Roberts University. My dream was to be the next great televangelist, which finally didn't come true until COVID, when we started live streaming, you know. So I came back from my time in Israel, and I changed my major from becoming the next great televangelist to studying the Old Testament. I became an Old Testament major. And remarkably, at Oral Roberts University, we had a modern Hebrew program. It was absolutely remarkable. So I ended up taking 3 years of modern Hebrew, and I ended up taking biblical Hebrew as well. And I finished with a minor in modern Hebrew. And I would love to tell you that I could really speak Hebrew to this day, but that's not the way things worked out. I had this vision that I was going to graduate, and then I was going to go perhaps to Hebrew University and go an academic route, and that's the gig my fiance signed up for. We're going to Israel, and he's going to go this academic route. But like Robert Frost says, and way leads on to way, and ended up getting deeply, deeply involved in an Episcopal church back then in the youth group, and running the youth group and adult Sunday school. And one day, this aged priest, I said, "Hey, good morning, Father." And he says, "Good morning, Father." And I think Denise was still fiance at that point. And she just went, "Oh no." So ended up going down a route in which I became an Episcopal priest. I was an Episcopal priest for 15 years and left the Episcopal Church in 2010, 15 years ago now, and have been the rector. It means rector is Latin for ruler, which is a really funny joke. So I have been the ruler of Emmaus for the last 15 years. So that's kind of who I am, my background. Now, I'm thrilled to be with you this evening, and I stand before you this evening aware that we are not just talking about ancient history or arcane academic topics. You know, we're here talking about Christians and Jews together. You know, the events of last week, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, is on our nation's mind. It's on people's minds all around the world. And I want to highlight a couple things as we get going this evening. It's critical of importance that people with deep differences, it's Christians and Jews, historically we are people of very deep differences. But here we are talking like people, right? People talking. I'm also aware that in our history, these very real differences, the Christians and the church have a lot to regret. A lot that I wish we could say wasn't there, but it is there. And yet, and yet we have a common history. We do, like the artwork. I love this image. I keep going back to this image of this common root, these two trees, and sharing a canopy and what we share. It's a powerful, powerful image because we do have a common history and we do share common values that have made Western civilization strong, peaceful, prosperous, and free. And I think people, I think our Jewish friends understand as they've dealt with radical Islam that radical Islam isn't, they don't operate out of the same worldview. They don't want to coexist, right? I mean, it's like not a thing for them. And what we're experiencing right now in America, apparently, is there are some people who have worldviews that do not want to coexist with things that seemed like self-evident truth just a few years ago. Like male and female, he created them. How dare you say such a thing? You are saying I don't have a right to exist as a human being, therefore I have a right to kill you. This is what we're dealing with. This is the kind of things that are going on. And this is why it's important that we understand our common roots and this canopy that we share. Even as this evening we go, Boris, you kind of had it easy in some ways. Because you got to do, here's all this great stuff we share. But the way you talked about the Crusades and the Inquisition, particularly the Inquisition last session, was absolutely fascinating. I mean, I learned things I'd never heard before. It was truly remarkable. But anyway, this evening I get to deal with where these two trees become very different trees. And so we're going to explore that and why that happens. So I am going to cover some of the same ground that Boris covered. The formative period of Christianity, the first century of what many call the Common Era, through the advent of the Roman Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century. Now, why do we want to go up to that point? Well, essentially, so 1st century, Herod the Great, the birth of Jesus, Pontius Pilate, all this business, up through the destruction of the temple in 70, Israel, Jews had a state, Israel, and there was a diaspora, right? So have a state and spread out like a lot farther than I ever realized. I mean, India, China, it was mind-boggling. So Jews have a state, but there's also a diaspora up till 70. 70, really the end of a Jewish state. That's the end of an independent, in any way, Jewish state until 1948, right? So, but the formation of the church, you have a group of dispersed people who never have a state, don't have any power like that, but come into power with the Emperor Constantine first in 313 with the Edict of Milan. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then when Constantine presides over the Great Council of Nicaea in 325, now all of a sudden the church has gone from being a persecuted minority to the faith of the emperor. It's absolutely remarkable. So this is quite the transition. So that's why I picked that as a bookend for tonight. So we focus on our shared roots, values, and future. And tonight we're going to look more at where we start splitting out. So if I could have the next slide. So there were a few of those dates that I ran you through from 313 to 325. So we go from Constantine's victory and the official toleration of the church in 313. I mean, just 15 years before that, Christians were persecuted, were murdered because of their faith, and all of a sudden they're tolerated, and then they're at the very center of the empire. And then the Council of Nicaea. So if we could go to the next slide, please. You all are familiar with this, I think, right? Like a fiddler on a roof in tradition. So I want to use this concept of tradition to frame what I'm talking about this evening. We all know these stories, I think. You know, the musical is based on a series of stories by Shalom Aleichem about Hasidic life in Eastern Europe. Now, we enjoy the stories because they're about an old and odd way of life, an endearing character, Tevye at the center of it all. One of the things that's so interesting and delightful about the stories is this way of life gave people a very, very strong sense of who they were, what it means to be part of a family. We could say their identity. They had a very, very strong sense of identity. Now, tradition is what binds a community together over time. So the image of the fiddler on the roof is that tradition in Tevye's time, in a lot of ways it's really a story about the Jewish experience of America. And also, interestingly enough, Christians' experience in the last 40 years in America of life that is changing really, really fast. Where tradition, people are just assuming that if it's old, it's bad. Where people used to assume if it's old, it's good. Now, if it's old, it's bad. Right? So life's changing. And if we go with the changes, the big question is, if we go with these changes, will our identity remain intact? If we accept the changes, will our identity as a people remain intact? So, if I could have the next slide. Back in 1997, I read a book that has shaped my thinking on these things. It's called After Virtue. It's by a Notre Dame philosopher and historian named Alistair McIntyre. It's a really important book that has impacted a lot of people. It's one of the hardest books I ever read because it's basically a history of philosophy in the Western tradition. And it's all kinds of names and technical terms, and it took me a long time to read it, but it was worth it. And it's a book that has stuck with me over years and years and years to kind of help me orient myself in an ever-changing culture. So here is the definition of tradition from Alistair McIntyre. Tradition is a historically extended, socially embodied argument, and an argument in part precisely about the goods that constitute that tradition. So you have an idea about what a good life is. Here's what a good life is. Now, how do we live that out? And you got all these things around it that help you live it out. The stories of your people, the way you do marriages, the way you do burials, the way you worship together, how you think about work, how you think about governance. All of these things kind of roll in together, and they are all focused on achieving what your community believes is a good life. That's your tradition. And then these things come along that challenge it. And some of them you say, yeah, we can adapt to that and we'll still be who we are. Or other things come along and you say, if we let that in, we will cease to be who we are. Tradition. So early Christianity, beginning with Jesus himself, dealt with the question of change and continuity. Change and continuity. So if I could have the next slide, please. So, as Boris illustrated, the controlling powers of the Jewish communities in the first century did not think that what Jesus or Peter, Paul, Stephen, or James were doing was in continuity with the faith of Israel. They were seen as destroyers of what held Israel together, the tradition. Now, the New Testament deals with this problem over and over and over and over and over. Continuity and change. The New Testament understands there's some pretty radical changes that happen with Jesus and what the church ends up doing. And the church believes that these things are actually in continuity what was there all along. So I'm going to try to explain that. So, of course, what is at stake here is a people's identity. So, quite simply, all the first Christians were Jews, and they saw Jesus as the faithful shoot come up out of the stump of Jesse's tree. They understood Jesus to be the true son of David. Now, many Jews also believed this, but many more, the majority, saw what Jesus and his disciples were up to as an invasive bug. You know, sort of the pine beetle, right? And you got to get rid of this before it destroys the forest. It's a break from tradition and therefore a threat to Jewish identity. And this is why Saul of Tarsus, this was his mission. His mission was to wipe out the followers of the way. We don't like the way these people are carrying out what they think it means to be truly Jewish. So, Jesus, disruptive force. If I could have the next slide, please. So these are a few things where Jesus is disruptive. He's disruptive about the Sabbath, the Shabbat. But he also believes he's a fulfiller. He's fulfilling. Jesus is a disruptor when it comes to Passover and the temple. Now, these aren't the only things where Jesus is disruptive, but I can't do it all in one night, right? Okay. So early on in his ministry, Jesus' conflicts were with a group of people called Pharisees, what would eventually really become Rabbinic Judaism. Now, the conflicts were over the faithful practice of the Torah. Honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. How? So how you do that in Hebrew, it's called, let's see if I get this right. Someone may correct me later, but it's referred to as halakha. It's the way of walking, how you walk. As in from Psalm 1, blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, right? It's how you walk, how you live out God's instructions. So the issue was with Jesus, was it right to heal people on the Sabbath? So many people regarded this as work. Now, Jesus regarded this Sabbath as a foretaste of his coming kingdom when people would have true rest and peace. So it was a day of freedom. So the healings that Jesus did were called deliverances. Deliverances. You're set free. Redemptions. And so Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. This is one of his disruptions, one of the first places where he's shaking up tradition. Well, as Jesus was doing these healings, he also taught people how to keep the Torah faithfully. And people noticed that he didn't quote the teachers who came before him. You know, the rabbinic tradition was, as so-and-so said, as so-and-so said, as so-and-so said. You know, Boris talked about the tradition of the fathers. This is from a famous, wonderful, wonderful book called Pirkei Avot, right? The sayings of the fathers. This idea that there is a tradition that's been handed down, and your authority as a teacher comes from, you've fully taken in the teachings and the lifestyle of your teacher, and now you bring them forward. So, I mean, in the same way that I'm not, I'm here in a uniform this evening. You call me, some of you may call me father. You don't have to call me father. My wife doesn't call me father. Actually, she calls me Father Honey, that's right. So, I just lost the room. So, okay. So the point is, my authority is conferred upon me by an organization bigger than myself. Hands were laid on me, conferring authority on me. I don't say, oh, this is what I think, so this is what you should think. Right? But rather, I'm ordained. That's what it means to be ordained. Well, Jesus didn't do that. He wasn't ordained by anybody. He didn't have a master. He didn't have a teacher. He didn't quote those rabbis who came before him. He just spoke. So people notice, he does a healing, he does a deliverance, then he does a teaching. He gives his famous Sermon on the Mount, and at the end of it, he says, I have not come to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. And it says in the Gospel of Matthew, and the people wondered because he was one who taught with authority, meaning his own authority. He didn't quote those who came before him. He quoted the Tanakh, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, but he didn't quote teachers who interpreted those things. He just did his thing. Okay. Now, let's go to what we Christians call Holy Week. After 3 years of ministry, predominantly in Galilee, Jesus comes to Jerusalem at Passover, and he's chosen this time with intent. Passover, of course, is the central story of Jewish identity. It's the story of how God delivered Israel from Egypt long ago, but it's also the pattern for shaping Jewish identity to this day. To this day. The Almighty cares for his people. He's with them, and he rescues them from oppression and brings them out into their own free land. Jesus has come to Jerusalem on purpose. Now, the first thing Jesus does that week is, on the first day of the week, he enters Jerusalem on a donkey, as prophesied in the prophet Zechariah. So this is a kingly kind of thing to do. And then he goes to the temple, and he wrests control of it for the day. He clears out the court of the Gentiles, the money changers, and he quotes the prophet Isaiah, "My house shall be a house of prayer for all people." So Jesus is asserting his rightful authority over the temple. Now, this doesn't make him very popular with the authorities who run the temple, right? But he's asserting his authority over it. He's saying he's come into Jerusalem as a king and as the true high priest. This is a disruptive kind of thing to do, right? So then throughout the course of the week, he prophesies the coming destruction of the temple, and he tells his disciples, when this happens, when this war comes, get out of town. Do not have anything to do with this. Run away. Well, Thursday of that week, Jesus celebrates Passover with his disciples. Now, for our theme here about tradition and change and continuity, Jesus takes the familiar symbols of the meal, the bread and the wine, and he turns them in a new direction. Now, there is, by the way, if you've read the story, in all three Gospels, and it's also in Paul's letter to his first letter to the church in Corinth, there's no lamb. There's no lamb there. And this is like, why is there no lamb at this Passover meal? This is like, what is going on? Instead of a lamb, he breaks the bread and he says that it is his body broken for us. And then taking one of the cups of wine, he says this is his blood poured out for us, inaugurating the new covenant that the prophet Jeremiah spoke of, a covenant in which our sins are forgiven and we get a new heart. So like the first Passover Exodus, the ritual meal is celebrated before the events. Did you ever notice that? Like Passover is celebrated before Passover? It's fascinating, right? But why does this happen? It happens because like you're going to see what is about to happen, what it means ritually before it happens. And then you celebrate it thereafter to participate in it from then on. Okay. So, perpetual remembrance. So that's what Jesus does, disruptor. Now we have to talk about Jesus' trial before the governing body at the temple, the Sanhedrin. Now I want to deal with something really, really difficult here. So if you go to the next slide, please. I'm pretty sure it's the next one. Yeah. I want to deal with the source of scapegoating Jews in many, many years to come. As you read the New Testament, especially in the Gospel according to John, you will hear, and then the Jews did this, the Jews did this, the Jews did this, the Jews did another thing. I think if I was a Jewish person reading the Gospel of John, I'd be like, oh my gosh, either all my ancestors were absolutely horrible people or this is just a smear. What's going on here? In church history, even leading theologians in the church would take this phrase out of the Gospel of John, and they would just smear Jews as Christ killers. I mean, it's deeply embarrassing, but it's there. So in this way, all Jews were blamed for the death of Jesus, lumped in with the betrayer, with Judas, and with the ruling elite. Thus, some people have actually called for the end of the use of the Gospel of John as an anti-Semitic book. Now, here's the thing. John himself, Yochanan, was Jewish. Jesus, Yeshua, and all his disciples are Jewish. So what are we to make of, and then the Jews? Does this refer to every Jew then, much less now? So contemporary scholars have realized we would be better off translating the word Judeos as Judeans. And this is a term not for every Jew, and not even for all the Jews living in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, but for a ruling group with great power and influence. The group who led the kangaroo court that called for the crucifixion of Jesus. And some contemporary Bibles will no longer say the Jews. They will say the Judeans. The Judeans, because not everyone who was there was calling for Jesus' death. It certainly wasn't every Jew in Jerusalem who was there for the Passover. It's an important distinction, and I hope it catches on in the translations of the New Testament, the Judeans. Well, back to the trial. Ultimately, the Sanhedrin wanted Jesus dead because he claimed authority over the temple, and he claimed that it would be destroyed and that he himself would replace it. That his body would somehow replace it. Like, that's crazy talk. That's what they heard, okay? They also were offended, took offense that Jesus, when they pushed him and pushed him and pushed him, are you the king? Yes. Are you the Son of the Most High? Yes. Now, on the Roman side of things, the Romans in charge of Judea at the time, Pontius Pilate, saw that Jesus wasn't actually a threat, a bit of a mystic. But he wasn't a threat. However, because Jesus spoke of the kingdom of God and of himself as its embodiment, the charge that was brought against Jesus was essentially insurrection. And so Pilate, to pacify the Sanhedrin and to avert an accusation that he didn't take the insurrection seriously, ordered Jesus crucified. Now, with the crucifixion and death of Jesus, his disciples went into hiding. They were in a total disarray. And none of it made any sense to them. None of it made sense to them. So this is where my church, the parish I lead, gets its name, Emmaus. Emmaus was a village about 7 miles away from Jerusalem, and a couple of Jesus' disciples were from this town. So it's Sunday afternoon. There are these rumors going around that the tomb is empty. He's been raised. But these two disciples Like, none of this makes any sense. Let's go home. So they're walking home, and along the way, this stranger meets them on the path. So if I could have the next slide, please. Maybe some of you have seen this painting. It's by a Swiss artist named Zund. But it imagines Jesus, this stranger, walking on the road with these two disciples. One is named Cleopas, who may be Joseph, Jesus' adopted father, may be his brother, which is really interesting. So they're dejected, they're confused, and the stranger says, "What are you talking about?" "What do you mean, what are we talking about? Are you the only person who's visiting Jerusalem who doesn't know what just happened?" "Well, what happened?" "And how Jesus of Nazareth. We were sure he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." That's a key term. That's a Passover term. He's going to restore Israel to what it was under David. Redeem Israel. But he's dead. But now, some of the people in our party said they went to the tomb. It was empty. They said they saw him. None of it makes any sense. And we're going home for supper. I mean, it's kind of like, right? So Jesus walks with them. The stranger walks with them. And Luke tells us that he explained everything in the scriptures how they were about him. But Luke goes on to tell us that it still didn't make any sense to them. It said that their hearts were starting to burn, like it was like starting to make sense, but it still didn't make sense. Everything that has happened isn't in continuity with what we knew was supposed to happen. This isn't how the tradition is supposed to work. So they arrive at Emmaus. These two disciples invite him in. It's supper. He breaks the bread, and Luke tells us that their eyes were opened when he broke the bread, and they recognized him. They realized who he was. And then they understood everything he had to say about his identity. So, what can we take from this? Back to our Fiddler on the Roof. The disciples of Jesus had an idea that he would fulfill the traditions and the tradition, what had been handed on in the Torah, the prophets, and writings. And in their minds, Jesus was the promised Messiah. He would redeem Israel. But cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree. So obviously, we were wrong. It couldn't have been true. We were wrong. But then, like one of those three strange visitors to Abraham, this stranger explains to them a pattern that they did not see. A pattern they were unaware of. So, they have come to see through the discontinuity, continuity. They are taught to see the tradition in a new way. The tradition in a new way. So the reason that all these disciples give for believing that it's okay to read the Bible, to read the Tanakh the way Christians read the Tanakh, is because Jesus was raised. You get rid of the resurrection and the whole thing falls apart. Like it just falls apart. This is why they thought, we're supposed to read it like this. So Paul called Jesus' resurrection his vindication. His vindication. Now, much of what we call the New Testament, whether it's in the four Gospels or in the account of the early church, that is the book of Acts, or the various writings we call letters, deals with how Jesus fulfills what I'm calling the tradition of the Bible. How does Jesus fulfill it? There are some key patterns, key fixtures in the tradition that undergo major, major changes. Changes Christians believe fit if we read the whole tradition through the lens of Jesus crucified and risen. So here are a few of these things that change. So if I got the next slide, please. So at the very beginning, we have these new people. We go at the beginning when we're in Jerusalem, Judea, and Galilee. What we now call Christianity was simply called the Way. We were followers of the Way, and everyone was Jewish, either Judean Jewish or Hellenistic Jewish from the diaspora. They're all Jewish, and they're called the Way. But then in Antioch, we start having Jews and this other group of people called God-fearers. So God-fearers were basically Gentiles who had come to believe in the God of Israel, but they didn't become Jews. You know, like Boris said last time, I don't think this circumcision, I don't think I'm cut out for it. All right, so anyway, all right, sorry. So especially this group of God-fearers, this was especially ripe territory for the early missionaries. These people who were really into the God of Israel, but didn't become Jewish. Like, oh, wow, this is incredible. So it was the God-fearers first. This is Antioch. And then when these missionaries, Paul, Peter, others, they spread out into Asia Minor and then into Rome, we start getting full-on pagans who come to believe in the God of Israel as they've approached him through Jesus. So that's kind of the journey. That's how we go from all Jews to Jews and God-fearers, where they're first called Christians, to the church. So the next slide, please. There are unchanged and changed traditions. Things that don't change. Love God and love your neighbor, right? Love God and love your neighbor. The Tanakh as sacred scripture. The Tanakh as sacred scripture. Interestingly enough, that came under attack in the 2nd century, and the church had to fight that. It was one of our first great battles for our identity. Fascinating thing. The switch from circumcision as the marker of belonging and identity to baptism. The switch from keeping the Sabbath to what Christians call the Lord's Day. Passover to the Lord's Supper or Eucharist. Understanding that the Day of Atonement is what happens on Good Friday, and one of the funny things, if you're unaware, one of the funny things about the English language is that we use the name of a pagan goddess to describe our most important festival. It's really frustrating, and I try to and it's unique to English and German. Many Christian cultures call the Sunday after Good Friday Pascha, Passover, not Oster, right? Easter. All right. Understanding from temple to Jesus' risen body. With the liturgical year, we go from the liturgical, fascinating thing about Old Testament calendar is it really has 2 anchors, Passover and Yom Kippur. And in the Christian calendar, the poles are Good Friday and Pascha, Easter Day, and Christmas. So the Christian calendar is all built around the events of Jesus' life. Now, last thing for my talk. This is timeline kind of stuff. So the next slide, please. When we go from Jesus' birth to the year 70, essentially, while Israel is a vassal state of Rome, it's still a Jewish state. And the early Christians are powerless. And then after 70 all the way up to 313, what do we have going on in the Jewish community and Christian communities living throughout the Roman Empire? We have rivals both claiming they are the true heirs of the tradition. So we're siblings at this point, having sometimes nice conversations and sometimes not so nice. But we're siblings. Okay. When we get to the Edict of Milan in 313, this is when Constantine has his great military victory. And he had this dream in which he was supposed to bring his soldiers into battle, not under the traditional Roman soldiers. Long before Michael Jordan made it cool, their symbol was a swoosh. It was Nike, the goddess of victory. And it's a swoosh because victory is always fleeting. You know, the goddess of victory she has wings. Victoria to the Romans, Nike to the Greeks. She has wings because you don't always win, right? But that was what was always on the Roman soldiers' shields and banners, was they're going for victory. Well, Constantine has this dream where he's supposed to put a sign of Jesus on his banners, and he does it, and they win. And so at that point he says, well, I'm supposed to at least tolerate these people. So that's what he does, 313. So now the church has gone from being simply siblings and rivals to the tradition to being tolerated, and then in a few short years at the very center of power to one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. So, where you deserve a break today. Thank you.
Is it on? It's on. Father Walker, thank you. That was wonderful. That was very interesting. I'm sure we got a lot of questions. So what we'll do, we'll take about a 10-minute break. Again, bathrooms are out. Go to the back wall, take a left. You run into the bathrooms. There's water in the back. Feel free to mingle, talk to somebody new. We'll come back in 10 minutes, and you can bring your questions, and we'll do a question and answer time. So don't take too long. Thanks a bunch. Check, check. Okay, we're gonna come back together. Can I get Pastor Jack? Pastor Jack, come on up. I got a microphone for you. So if you've never done this before, shh. Don't turn on the music. That makes everybody feel like it's intermission. They go for popcorn and hot dogs and stuff then. It's like a Nuggets game. Okay, Pastor Jack. Everybody, if you've never met Pastor Jack Sayre, this is my wonderful friend, Pastor Jack. He leads a church in Franktown called Castlewood Canyon Church. He is not gifted with microphones. Oh, he is gifted with microphones. So he's going to be our Q&A guy tonight. I just got to brag on Jack, though. We have had dozens of events and things like this over the last few years, and I don't think maybe he's missed one. Like, I've drug him out to Jewish Colorado events so he could meet Noah Tishby, and he didn't even know who he was meeting. So it was amazing. I got a picture. We got a picture. So anyway, what's going to happen is if you have a question, which I know that many of you probably have lots of good questions, raise your hand, and Jack is going to come around and he's going to give you the microphone so you can ask your question. Brad, you always get to be our first question asker.
Not wasting any time. I love it.
And we're going to go for it.
Thanks. So in the book of Acts, very early on in the formation of the church, the 30s or 40s, 50s, there's discussion and expression of about thousands of Jews, including some of the Pharisees, some of the establishment, are turning because of Peter's ministry. And I'm wondering if there's thousands and thousands, was there some event or something that happened, or maybe there's something that didn't happen that should have happened, that all of a sudden, by the time you get to the 70s, the 80s, and on, something turned, and so it wasn't just a Jewish religion or a Jewish sect, but it became something for outsiders. It became more Gentile. And I'm wondering, was there some event or something that wasn't tended to?
One of my favorite things is in the book of Acts when it describes, if my memory's correct, so Peter has given a speech, and a lot of people are cut to the heart, and they come to believe that what Peter is saying about Jesus is true. And it says, and many were converted that day, were repented, and were baptized, even some priests. And that's one of my favorite lines. If a priest can be converted, anybody, I've known a few priests. Anyway, so what ends up happening is, and Boris talked about this last week, about how Saul of Tarsus was involved with basically that ruling group in Jerusalem saw the way as a threat to the tradition, and therefore as a threat to the people's identity. And so they were starting to stamp it out. They were starting to arrest people. And there was the stoning of Stephen, who was a Hellenistic. He was a Jew from the diaspora. And he was this new leader among the Hellenized Jews. So he's stoned. And at that point, it was like everyone, all these first followers of the way, they just were in this sort of holy huddle and enjoying one another's presence, and they were sharing their life's treasure. And it says they worshiped in the temple, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, the breaking of the bread and the prayers. And then this happens, and then they scatter. They just scatter throughout the diaspora. Like seeds, kind of like blowing on a dandelion, and off they go. So wherever the diaspora was, they went. Except for a core remained in Jerusalem for a very, very long time. James, the half-brother of Jesus, was the head of that community, and he was killed in 62. So that's how long this community remained. And then when things got really, really bad in 65, that's when the Jerusalem community fled. They left. They remembered Jesus' prophecies. By the way, it's a really funny thing. A lot of modern New Testament scholars, more liberal scholars, say that Jesus' predictions about the destruction of the temple were made up after the event by the church when the church wrote the Gospels. As if a Jewish prophet couldn't say, there's a war coming with the Romans, and get away. Come on. I don't know. It's just irritating. So, did that explain?
Just to back up, you mentioned the book of Acts, and so I know that not everybody in here is a Christian.
Thank you.
So the book of Acts is one of the 29 books in the New Testament, right? So if you were grabbed the New Testament, you'd see Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then the fifth book is the book of Acts. So just in case there was confusion on that, that's what we're talking about
So
here.
let me tell you about who wrote that book. His name is Luke. Luke was a Greek doctor, it's interesting. He's the only Gentile. He's the only Gentile author in the New Testament. So he was from Philippi in Greece. He met Paul in Philippi and started traveling with Paul. He was Paul's traveling companion. He went with Paul when Paul went to Jerusalem with a big offering. I mean, just in the way that the diaspora, throughout the diaspora, they would send like a temple tax to Jerusalem as a way to honor Jerusalem. Well, Paul got these Gentiles to take up a collection to send kind of to the home office in Jerusalem. And Paul went there himself, and Luke was with him. And Luke describes what he's done as he put together an orderly account. So he interviewed the people that were there. So that's who Luke was. His first volume was the story of Jesus. His second volume is the book of Acts, and that's the story of the early church. I mean, every once in a while, people will give this kind of Dan Brown stuff. Well, the Gospels were written at the Council of Nicaea in 325 and blah, blah, blah. Oh my gosh. As I've heard Dan Brown's novels described, they're the only books you can read when you actually know less after you've read them than before them, right? Okay.
Questions? Raise your hands. I thought I saw one over there, but we've got a lady right over here.
What's the derivation of the word Gentile?
It's goyim. It means nations. It just means of the nations. So there's basically, you have, you're either the people or the nations. You're either the people of Abraham, Israel, or the nations. So it's a way to speak about everybody who isn't your people, who isn't the people.
There's Israel and there's everybody else.
Yeah.
That's kind of how the Bible breaks it down.
Yeah. So by the way, that's not that
I didn't
weird.
write it.
That's not that weird. I mean, you go all around the world, and you could talk about the Navajo, like their name for themselves is something like the Dine, and it means the people. And then if you're not Navajo, you're not the people. It's because identity is a big, big, big deal. And I think in America, in this gigantic country where we're held together by a covenant, a constitution, we sort of take for granted what it takes to hold a people together.
My name's Richard, and I was wondering if John, when he wrote the Judeans, weren't most of the disciples from Galilee area? So weren't they referring to the location rather than the people, the location where all this happened, maybe?
Okay, so it's a fascinating thing, the interrelationship of Galilee and Jerusalem, Judea, because Jesus and most of the disciples were from Galilee. However, let me see. So it's really interesting. Like, for example, the disciples are in the Garden of Gethsemane after after they celebrate the Passover Seder, they go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and they're in a garden, and that garden is owned by the family of John Mark, and John Mark's mother works in Herod's household. I got that pretty close. But the point is, there are lots of interrelationships between people who live in Galilee and people who live in Jerusalem. So they go to Jerusalem regularly. It's an ordinary part of their life. So I don't think it reflects I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I don't think it reflects a anti-Jerusalem, Galilee versus Jerusalem sort of thing. It's more about that ruling cabal, which had some good intentions. We want to save our people. We do this for the good of our people. But the Caiaphas family, they were pretty corrupt. I mean, they were more like the Borgias family when they controlled the papacy. I mean, they were bad news. So.
Okay. I need Phyllis's help. So the book that had the writings of a lot of the rabbis, did the ones that wrote, that are recorded from before Jesus, did they point out some messianic prophecies?
So that's an interesting question. So like I talked about Pirkei Avot, that's the sayings of the fathers. That's not like the big point of that book, as I recall. It's been 25 years since I read Pirkei Avot. I'm sorry. There's a lot of writing going on that ends up not being recognized. This is a really fascinating thing. There's a lot of writing going on in the 200s and 100s that ends up not going into the Tanakh, but was very, very popular everywhere. And these are books like the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the Testament of Moses, the books of Enoch. It's kind of wild. A lot of it's kind of wild apocalyptic stuff, but where there was a lot of speculation and thought about who the Messiah would be that became much more developed. And interestingly, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, in a sense, the Jewish canon tightened with just the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And all this other Jewish writing that was so popular was no longer recognized in the Jewish communities, but it was kept alive in Christian communities. And it's turned out to be invaluable for the study of the Second Temple period. It's a whole great big field of study. Like right now at Emmaus, Jim back here is teaching a class on the book of Jude, and the book of Jude quotes the book of Enoch, which is like, it raises all kinds of interesting questions. Like, all right, it's not in the canon, but it uses a book that isn't in the canon as its source. What does this mean? So it was really popular in those kind of books. But there was a lot of speculation going on. There were a lot of different ideas. We could talk about Judaism, but some people say it's more accurate to talk about Judaisms. In the same way, we could talk about Christianity today. Well, there's I left the Episcopal Church, or as I would say, the Episcopal Church left me. We're not the same. It's sort of like the difference between Reform and conservative and Hasidic, right? There's a big variety. There was a big variety in the Second Temple period too.
Good question, good answer. Other questions? Raise your hand if you got a question. Sure.
David Tennis in the back. Oh, that's great.
So, whether from 70 to Milan, that's a wide time. Was there anything else that kind of led to the separation of kind of the Jewish Christians and then rabbinic Judaism?
So I will tell you that I am working on this book, reading this book, Vines Intertwined, A History of Jews and Christians from the Babylonian Exile to the Advent of Islam. And it's kind of a whopper.
The last 200 pages are indexed. It's not that. It's not that.
Yeah, right.
impressive.
The last 200 pages are all notes, right? There is a lot that I don't know about that time period. 130 to 313. I've done a lot of reading in what's called the Church Fathers. So this is that period of Christian writers in the 200s and in the 100s, 200s. I've read a lot of what they have to say. They have some pretty spicy anti-Semitic stuff, but also at the same time, they have deep engagement with the Tanakh. I learned from this book. I mean, besides Jerome, who was responsible for the creation of the Latin Vulgate. So I think it's still the authoritative translation of the Bible for Roman Catholics. It was a Latin Bible. He did not go from the Greek translation, but from the Hebrew, which he learned from rabbis in Bethlehem. So to just paint Jerome as anti-Semitic isn't fair. One of the greatest scholars of the ancient church was named Origen. He was in Alexandria, thoroughly steeped in the writings of Pliny. Yeah, Pliny. No, not Pliny. Philo, a prominent Hellenistic Jew. So there's a lot of nasty stuff that goes on in these little rivalries, but there's also kind of strange moments of friendship and learning and even some of our debates to this day between Protestants and Roman Catholics about what the Bible really is. It goes back to what was written in Hebrew and what was in Greek. And Jerome said if it wasn't in Hebrew, it doesn't belong in the Bible. And the rest of the church is saying, but we've always read it in Greek from the beginning. All these quotations are out of the Septuagint. They're not out of a Hebrew translation. It's fascinating. The War and Peace. It's called Vines Intertwined, A History of Jews and Christians. It's a history book. It's, the author, it's kind of hard to, we can make it available later. Yeah.
We'll take a picture and
Yeah.
post it online.
We'll take a picture and post it.
Well, I forget who asked that question. It's interesting because between 100 and 313, there's not a ton written except from the church fathers, and it doesn't take very much digging. If you start Googling the church fathers like Ignatius, they just said awful things about the Jewish people. They just said awful things about Israel. And some people would say, well, that was part of debate and dialogue. Like it wasn't all that uncommon to call names and to be derogatory toward one another. So there would be one side or one argument, but then when you start to dig in, you go, no, there's not really an excuse here for calling Israel a whore or saying that God divorced Israel or that God's angry with Israel. And really, I would say that probably the bedrock accusation that fueled Christian anti-Semitism for the last 2,000 years, that still today white supremacists conjure up or call upon, is the Jews killed Jesus, right? They committed deicide, and so therefore God's all done with them, and they're horrible people, and we should either extinguish them or just move on from them. And that's that claim. That's probably the foundational one that has made far too many Christians for far too long think we should look down upon our Jewish neighbors. And I think that's important to bring up, especially when we're talking about that 100 to 300 or 100 to 313 period, because it's prevalent. It comes out, and whether we can figure out if they were actually anti-Semitic or not, they sound horribly anti-Semitic. So,
But I do think it's helpful to remember that in that time period, it's brothers who are arguing. And when brothers are arguing, and I have 3 brothers, and I could tell you some stories. My wife could tell you, like, then his brother pulled a gun on him, and oh my goodness, like, he didn't pull the trigger. And I did run. I didn't stay. But, brothers do things, and they say things to each other. Brothers fight with each other in a way that, like, if other people were doing, you'd say, oh my goodness, but, well, Jacob and Esau, right? Cain and Abel. It's not always pretty.
no, it's not.
No.
I saw another hand back here. Didn't I? Raise your hand if you had a question. Oh, right here, right in the front. Jack, right here.
Thank you. Quick question, probably quick answer. Would you please describe the concept of being grafted in?
So, yeah, that's so the question is, describe being grafted in.
You probably should give the scripture reference where
I
that
will.
phrase gets used.
So this is a phrase used by Paul in his magnum opus, the book of Romans. So the book of Romans, I got to watch the time here because I could do this all night. All right, so the book of Romans is really Paul's magnum opus. A lot of Paul's work are letters that are written to deal with specific problems that are going on. But Romans is a systematic tome where what he's dealing with is, so in the mid-50s, the Jews had actually been kicked out of Rome. They've come back into Rome. The early church in Rome has Jews and Gentile, Jewish background believers and Gentiles in it. And there are lots and lots of questions about what does it mean for us to be one people now in Yeshua? What does it mean? So a lot of what Paul is up to in Romans is answering that question. How is it that Jesus is actually the fulfillment of the tradition? Because there's a break here, but how is this the deep pattern that was in there? So Paul is dealing with that big problem in that book. And one of the things that Paul is really clear about, and Boris asked me a question about this on the break, is one thing that Paul is really clear about in Romans is that the blame for the death of Jesus is not laid at the feet of any group of people, but it's rather the human condition after Genesis 3 has to be dealt with because the Almighty wants to be in a relationship of hesed, of steadfast love with everybody. And so Paul's conviction is that the Almighty himself became one of us to deal with this problem, so that all people stand equally condemned, and all people have this opportunity through the hesed of the Almighty expressed in Yeshua to enter into a relationship. So when we get to Romans 9 through 11, Paul is dealing with, all right, how then are we supposed to, given that we say Jesus is the fulfillment of everything, how are we supposed to think about Jews in Israel? And Paul kicks off the section saying, how I wish that all of my people believed as I believe. I would give my own self that they would all know and believe what I know and believe. And then he says in chapter 11 to these Gentiles who are getting kind of cocky and arrogant, he basically says, hey, remember, you're only here because they were here before you. You were a wild olive shoot that has been grafted onto this tree, this olive tree. You're a wild shoot that has been grafted on. Now, some of them are no longer on the tree, and that's heartbreaking. And we want them all to come on the tree again. So there's discontinuity, right? I mean, there's discontinuity. It shakes it up. But he wants all these Gentiles who have been brought into this thing to have a sense of humility and gratitude, and to realize that outside of this great tree of what the Almighty has done through the people of Israel, outside of this tree, you are a wild olive shoot that cannot produce anything worthwhile. Short answer? Kitsat?
You could, pastors preach for hours on that to try to get people to understand it. You did it in about 5 minutes, so good job.
It's tough.
Coming to your church this weekend. Other questions? We got time for a few more. I don't know, Brad.
Brad, again.
2 in one night?
All right.
We're going to start charging.
Okay. I'll get out my my visa. I've got a question about the Jewish feasts early on. There's mention, of course, of Passover. You talked about Passover. There's also mention of Jesus celebrating Hanukkah, and there's also mention of Paul. I think he was longing to come and celebrate one of the feasts. I forget which one it was. And so it seems like really early on, celebrating the feasts for at least the Jewish members of the way, that was an important thing. And I'm wondering, was there, because by the time you get to the Council of Nicaea, that's almost vanished. And I'm wondering, at least that's what I've heard, what happened to sort of remove the celebration of the Jewish feast from the way, the church?
So, by the way, the supposedly anti-Semitic Gospel of John is built on the Jewish feasts. The whole book, every major event is tied to one of the Jewish feasts. It's really interesting. I mean, everything that Jesus, all like John isn't writing a book like this, a history book. John is organizing the story of Jesus in such a way that it's actually built on the Jewish feasts. And each of the feasts reveals something about Jesus' character, and Jesus reveals the true nature of the feast. It's really cool. All right. So anyway, now we totally geek out. All right. So as the church moves farther and farther away from its Jewish roots, and it becomes more and more independent, and it's more and more focused on proving that it's better, it moves away from those feasts. That's the bad part of the story. That's the bad part of the story. But the other part of the story is the church organizes its life around the death and resurrection of Jesus, and then the birth of Jesus. I know everyone in this room has heard that that the church took over Saturnalia in the Roman period to celebrate Jesus' birth. It's a total fiction. It's an absolute lie. We know that by the 220s, the church was celebrating Jesus' birth on December 25th. Well, why would they do this? Well, because they got out a calendar and they believed that the year Jesus was crucified, that year was, it was on March 25th. That year, Good Friday, was March 25th. And there was an ancient belief that people were conceived and died on the same day. Conceived and died on the same day. Important people in history conceived and died on the same day. So if Jesus died on March 25th, therefore he was conceived on March 25th. Go 9 months, and what do you get? December 25th. This is what the ancient church believed. All the Saturnalia stuff is bunk. I mean, it's just bunk. It's so irritating. And I read it in Christian publications, usually with Christians who are so ashamed of our Christian history that they won't own it. And I think there are things that we should be ashamed of, and there are things that we should just own and rejoice in, be who you are and rejoice in it. And when you make a mistake, go, I am chief among the sinners, right? Have mercy on me, O God, according to your loving kindness. Blot out my sins. Move on, right? So, all right. So the center of the church's life becomes these two main hubs. And the Christian calendar is built on those two events, the death and resurrection of Jesus and the birth of Jesus, with seasons on either end of them to prepare you for it, a penitential season leading up to it, and then a season of rejoicing after it. That's the historic Christian year. And a lot of Christians, it's not in the Bible, I won't touch it. That's from, the Catholics. We were doing this really, really early. Own it.
I think just to go back to your question too, though, there was an intentional pulling away from the Jewish people, especially when when Christianity became a state religion in Rome. The Jews were not looked very kindly upon, right? And so the Christian church said, let's go ahead and make a separation here, right? And so some of the Jewish traditions went out the window. Plus, you just got to remember, after 100 whatever AD, as soon as you don't have Jewish leadership in the church anymore, the Gentiles go, we're doing fine without those guys, right? And so it was easy to begin to pull away from those traditions because guess what? Those weren't Gentile traditions. Yeah. So I think both of those things have to kind of be factored in there too. The church was pulling away. It was a little bit pragmatic, right? We're under the good graces of Rome now. The Jews aren't. Let's create even more distance. That's better for us.
And I think it's fair to say that with the war from 65 to 70, the Romans really turned. The Romans hated the Jews at that point. So Gentiles would be motivated to get as far away from them as possible as well.
Real quick, if you raised your hand in the last 90 seconds, just hold it up again. Okay, we're taking note. We got two over here and right here.
Can you tell us how Christianity views the Old Testament and some of the other writings that are within the Tanakh?
You only get 2 minutes.
2 minutes. So the 2-minute explanation.
That's a big question.
It's a very important question. Essentially, the way Christianity views the Tanakh is Christianity views the Tanakh, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, and then the New Testament. That we view the Tanakh, we view the entire Bible as one story that leads to Jesus. So we love the Tanakh. We eat, sleep, drink the Tanakh. My wife and I do our prayers together every day. We read either from the Torah, the prophets, the writings every single day. Every day. We believe it is God's inspired word. And that without the Tanakh, we could not possibly understand who we are and what our faith is. So it's really interesting in the 2nd century, there was a Christian priest who was deeply, deeply into Greek philosophy, and he actually believed that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament were two different gods. There was a Jewish God and a Christian God, and that Jewish God was all about rules and vengeance, and the Christian God was about grace and joy and blah, blah, blah. And in the early church, the church at that point said, no, this is absolutely wrong. And this is when we first get the first real clear statements out of the second century church about our total dependency on Israel to get the Tanakh. So that's a moment of that issue of continuity and change, of embracing where we our roots, embracing the base of what we were.
For some of you in the room, maybe for our Jewish friends, you may on accident, I'm so sorry if you do, you may find a Christian who says, that doesn't matter. I've run into a dozen in my life who say, Old Testament doesn't matter, Tanakh doesn't matter, Israel doesn't matter, and it's kind of a package deal. All those things don't matter. If one doesn't matter, none of it matters. So
they're heretics.
Wonderful, yes,
heretics.
Wonderful people like Father Walker here. They're telling you what the main and plain kind of evangelical Christian doctrine would be. There are groups out there that they throw it all out and they say it doesn't matter. Don't be shocked when you run into those, or if you run into those people. But that's not main and plain evangelical doctrine. That doesn't fall within the pale of orthodoxy, is what sometimes is the phrase that's used to describe Christian doctrine. So just wanted to say that, tag that on. Hazel.
My question ties together all of these. Is it not true that God says, these are my feasts? He doesn't say they're Jewish feasts. He doesn't say they are for everyone who follows Yeshua as king. So there are also people who believe in Yeshua, who celebrate all of God's feasts, and we also call ourselves Christian. And is that not a growing number in the body?
There is a growing number of people who believe that. There's a certain, the way you articulate it makes a lot of sense to me. That we don't keep the feasts of the Tanakh is heartbreaking. I think it was a sad development in the course of the church. I think we lose the understanding of who we are by not keeping the feasts. I mean, just like it, if you kept the feasts, you'd read the Gospel of John, you'd go, oh, here we are. It's Tabernacles. Let's read this. So.
One more.
We're officially over, aren't we?
Yeah.
But I could do this all night.
I technically, in my mind, this goes till 8:30. So.
Oh, okay, good.
But that's
good.
so that we have buffer.
Okay, cool.
Ronnie, go ahead.
So that kind of answered my question, actually, the question before, just because I've been pretty confused as a Jew and one that believes that Jesus is the Messiah. Coming from Israel, I have just been a little confused on does it matter and should I be celebrating all the festivals? So
that's a good point.
that kind of answered my question because I feel like it is important. So.
It is important, and I think that Christians would understand, we would understand our faith much better if we kept the festivals. But I would say if we kept them as Christians. You follow me? So sometimes I get concerned when I see Christians who are very embarrassed of Christian history, pick up the Mishnah, Josephus, read about how Passover was celebrated after the destruction of the temple, and won't come near a liturgical church, but start doing liturgical worship that's sort of Jewish. My wife said something. Speak. Your servant is listening. It's rude in a way. I mean, to me, it's rude to the Christian tradition. One of the funny things, so I grew up as Pentecostal, and by definition, Pentecostals aren't into rituals. Okay, like we don't do rituals except for coming to the altar. All right, so we don't do rituals. My introduction to a ritualistic version of Christianity was visiting a synagogue and picking up a siddur, right, a liturgical prayer book. Like, what do you know? And then I discover things like when Jesus was in the synagogue at Nazareth on the Shabbat, and he was handed the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, they were actually following a liturgical, they had a cycle of readings that were followed in synagogues, a cycle. And Jesus was handed the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and then he reads about the year of Jubilee, and he talks about how the year of Jubilee is fulfilled in him. I guess all of which is, what am I trying to say? I think there's a beautiful thing that happens when Christians study the Hebraic roots of the Christian faith and seek to incorporate those roots. There are ways that can be done respectfully. There are ways that can be done disrespectfully. I also think, as someone in what we call the Catholic tradition, when I bump into Christians who want nothing to do with Christian history, but somehow or another think worshiping in a sort of Jewish way with some klezmer music is cool. I don't think it's that cool. I don't know, I might be making some of my Christian friends uncomfortable now.
You've been making your Jewish friends uncomfortable for the last 2 hours.
That's
so you're
awesome.
Good. I'm joking. I don't think you have. But, well, I think what was asked and what you're saying, it brings up a really important point. We shouldn't have Christians that are appropriating Jewish tradition, right? And I understand from many conversations with my Jewish friends where they say, "Why are you taking our stuff?" Like, why are you ripping off our traditions and our holidays? And I think, wouldn't it be beautiful if Christians and Jews could come together and celebrate the Passover or Shabbat together, and we just ask our Jewish friends 1,000 questions. What do you think about this? What's your tradition? Why did you do it that way? How long has it been around? Is that in the Bible? And Christians have 1,000 questions about those things, because sometimes, believe it or not, in the information age, we just get on Google and we go, oh, well, that's a Jewish thing. I think we'll just try that on Friday night, right? And they don't understand that their Jewish neighbor looks at this entirely differently. And so I think, especially for our organization, for me personally, I want to look at my Jewish friend and say, help me understand this stuff. And then, then I got to go home and do the wrestle of, okay, I see connections, though, between my Christian traditions and Jewish tradition. I think that's important because we can't do classes like this if Christians go, oh, I get what you guys do over there, you Jewish people. Now I'm going to go do it and do it better and do it my way, right? And my Jewish friends are going, boy, that was really terrible, right? Like, maybe we're not friends anymore. So I just feel like that needs to be said because that matters a lot to me, for all of my Jewish friends here in the room, and I think for Father Walker too. That
So
we're not here to appropriate your culture.
I think part of the deal about this cultural moment is that there is such a deep disrespect for tradition in our culture that people think it's fine to go out and grab things sort of a la carte and put things together however they want to make them feel connected to God. So when Madonna gets into Kabbalah, here's a pop singer who calls herself Madonna, which is sacrilegious. And then she's like into Kabbalah, this Jewish mysticism. This is a la carte spirituality. This is, I take what I want when I want it. I use it how I want it. Now, this is the very thing that that McIntyre in this book that I talked about is writing about when we think about modernity and this thing in our culture that a tradition is something that makes a community. And it's a kind of discipline and order that you live under. And it shapes your life. It makes you and your people who you are. And the good news with that is it can give you a really strong identity. The bad news with that is it can make you really angry at people who aren't in your group. Right? So that's what we have to, that's kind of like sort of what we have to negotiate. So like I bump into people now that they kind of think Anglicanism is interesting because it's different than big evangelicalism. A bunch of songs and a rock band and a smoke machine and TED Talk and, oh, wow, you got all this cool old stuff. I want some of your cool old stuff. Like, leave my cool old stuff alone, okay? If you want to experience our community and this thing that we put ourselves under, the way we worship, what we do with our babies, how we name our children, how we do weddings, how we bury people. If you want to be part of this tradition, be part of this tradition, but don't just cherry pick us. And I just would want to say the same thing. Like, let's be careful about cherry picking. There's so much we can learn. Some of my favorite books are The Jewish Roots of the Eucharist. It's one of my favorite books by a Roman Catholic scholar.
Eucharist means communion.
Oh, sorry. Eucharist it's the Greek term for thanksgiving. It means communion. One of my favorite books, The Jewish Roots of the Eucharist. You cannot understand the heart of Christian worship without understanding the Jewish roots. It's absolutely fascinating. You can't read the Gospel of John intelligently without understanding the festivals. You don't get it. Like, you fundamentally don't get it. Wow.
Yeah, amen. David, just put that shared roots, the 2 trees slide, put that back up. I feel like we really went deep on this tonight, and maybe there was some discomfort. We're not trying to make anybody uncomfortable, but at the same time, we're just trying to tell the truth. Like, we want our Jewish friends to understand what we believe, what we think. Hopefully, maybe you leave tonight and go, I'm never going back there. I know too much about what they think now. But we really appreciate that you bear witness with us, because
those are
I
pretty
think
trees too.
Those are great trees
sequoias,
too. Those are the trees. If you saw the whole picture, but I think you did such a good job tonight of really getting into that common root system, that was in the early church. And then, of course, we went a little ways in terms of watching the divide happen. So you did a great job.
Well, thank you.
And,
so, I like to do a little commercial for next time, because
yes,
I get to go from Constantine to the Reformation.
This is Boris Drasnin level stuff.
Okay. And
that's a long time period.
It's a long time period, and there's a lot of tough stuff that happens as well. There's the Crusades, the Inquisition, so on. But there are also things that happen in that time period that are formative to Western civilization. And there are things that happen that are headed towards this canopy that we share. And yes, that there's some ugly moments, but there are also things that happen along the way that are the beginnings of what ends up happening in America, and where we get this incredible society where we don't have to be absolutely united in our faith in order to share a country in peace. And some of these things are things that happen in the Roman church and in the medieval church. So I'm going to pull out a few of those examples because they are the building blocks of how we get to the United States of America. So that'll be fun. It won't all just be like,
It will be fun.
oh, more tough stuff.
And you're a
Oh,
great
smokes.
presenter. We love listening to you. So we're excited. That's a month from now because we've got a long break because we know that we're coming up on Rosh Hashanah this next week and 10 days of awe and then Sukkot. And I mean, if you're not Jewish, then gosh, you should wish you were Jewish. There's a whole month of holidays right there. But we're going to take several weeks off because of that. We'll make sure and communicate with you via email about the next date. It'll be back here in this church again, and we've got the same wonderful speakers. So, Father Walker, thank you. Thank you to all of you. We went a little longer tonight. This was fun. Thank you for your attention. We'll see you next time.